One of my favorite things to talk about in this class is the psychopath, and students really like to talk about this as well. So what is a psychopath? Well, I'm sure you've heard that term before, and one of the interesting things in this lecture is that inevitably students will start to recognize friends, family, acquaintances that have some of the characteristics of a psychopath. But when you hear that word psychopath, most of you would think of like a psychotic killer, right? A serial killer. That's what most people think, but that's not necessarily true. So I want to discuss the concept of a psychopath, and you need to know that this is on a continuum. But at one end of the continuum, most people think of a guy somewhat like this fellow right here, Hannibal Lecter.
It's your turn to tell me, Clarice. You don't have any more vacations to sell. Why did you leave?
Okay, so he's a fictional character, but a great example of a psychopath. Very scary guy. But he's at one really far extreme end of psychopathy. Now, this fellow right here, any guesses on who that is? Well, that's Ted Bundy, and he's a serial killer in the United States. Another classic example of a psychopath. But again, really extreme. So what is a psychopath? How do we identify a psychopath? How are you going to be able to spot psychopaths in your day-to-day life? Well, the first thing that I want to do is differentiate between a bunch of different terms here. The first one is psycho. So where does psycho come from? Psycho is like a slang word. It could be slang for psychopath, but it also could be slang for psychological or psychopathology. Who knows? Don't use that one. Now, psychotic or psychosis. What do those mean? Being psychotic means that you have psychosis. But what is psychosis? Well, psychosis is a break from reality that is characterized by hallucinations and or delusions. So hallucination can really be any of the five senses, but typically it'll be auditory in a psychiatric population. And then delusions are firmly held beliefs that are rigidly held despite incontrovertible evidence otherwise. So you think that the FBI is following you around or something like that. Now, sociopath versus psychopath. And I probably should put antisocial in there as well, but I didn't, because we'll address antisocial personality disorder in just a second. So what is a psychopath? What is a sociopath? Guess what? The quick answer is that they're exactly the same thing. But look at the root words here. Socio versus psycho. So this implies sociological etiology or causation, and this psychological. So in this class, stick with psychopath. Again, they're basically the same thing. Some academics will differentiate between the two, and I'll show you one class of psychopath later on that resembles sociopath, but for this class, exactly the same thing. And then the word psychopathology, this really means anything that goes wrong with the mind. So this encompasses all psychological disorders. So a psychopath or psychopathy are the terms that you want to use. Okay, so a psychopath's personality is characterized by shallow emotions, reduced fear, lack of empathy, lack of guilt, egocentricity, superficial charm, manipulativeness, irresponsibility, impulsivity, a parasitic lifestyle, and criminality. Notice it doesn't really say anything in there about serial killing or anything like that. Well, violence may be part of a psychopath's repertoire, but not always. Think about somebody that's built like this. How would they function in society? Well, the first person to really talk about psychopathy was this guy, Hervey Cleckley, and he wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity. And this is really where the classic descriptions of a psychopath first start in the psychiatric literature. He was a psychiatrist. And then if we follow the history, the next person in line to really delve into this and become an expert in this area is Dr. Robert Hare. So this is a nice quote here from Dr. Hare. Compared with other major clinical disorders, little systematic research has been devoted to psychopathy, even though it is responsible for far more social distress and disruption than all other psychiatric disorders combined. Now, the research literature in this area has been growing. I mean, he's been working at this since the late 80s. Here's a quote from one of his books. Social predators who charm, manipulate, and ruthlessly plow their way through life, leaving a broad trail of broken hearts, shattered expectations, and empty wallets. Completely lacking in conscience and empathy, they selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt or regret. I like that quote. I think that really gives you an insight as to what somebody with these characteristics would be like. But they'd probably be just as at home in a corporate office as they would be on the streets. So could somebody like this murder? Sure. But they could also raid your pension or retirement fund and not feel bad about that at all. So that quote was out of this book called Without Conscience. This is an excellent book. I think it was published in 1993. Now, when I was a college student at Michigan State, I saw this book on the shelf of the library and randomly picked it up. Now, I was a psychology major and I had an interest in forensic psychology, but this book really changed my life and probably was one of the major factors that got me interested in the field of forensic psychology. So if you are interested in this area, it's a great book, and it's really pretty well written, and it talks about Dr. Hare's life. Now, let's watch a short interview with Dr. Hare talking about the assessment of psychopathy.
A leading researcher in the study of psychopathy is Dr. Robert Hare, a psychologist at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Hare has spent much of his career in a search to identify and understand the behavioral characteristics and personality traits of the psychopath. His recent book, Without Conscience, summarizes this research.
Well, we can describe a psychopath or psychopathy as a clinical construct characterized by a cluster of characteristics and features. The cluster would include interpersonal characteristics, how we deal with other people, how the individual interacts with somebody else, affective characteristics, feelings, emotions, and other behaviors, including socially deviant behaviors.
Psychopaths are often described as callous, impulsive, manipulative, glib, egocentric, predatory, grandiose, and lacking empathy and emotional affect. Hare's study of what makes up a psychopathic personality has taken him down many avenues of scientific inquiry.
I've been working in this area for quite a long time, and for the first 10 or 15 years, I, like most other researchers and clinicians, was very frustrated by the fact that we didn't have some sort of standardized measure of this particular construct. People intuitively knew what they were talking about. If one read Herbie Cleckley's book, The Mask of Sanity, for example, you would have a pretty good idea about what a psychopath is, but how do you communicate that to somebody else? The problem is that we have never had a proper measuring tool for assessing this particular disorder.
In the early 1980s, Hare and his colleagues developed a psychometric test, now known as the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. Consisting of a 20-item rating scale, the checklist measures such things as glibness, superficial charm, cunning, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callousness, lack of empathy, impulsiveness. Each item is scored on the basis of explicit criteria contained in the manual. Possible scores on the scale range from 0 to 40. For the average person, a typical score would be 5. Anyone with a score of 30 or above would be considered a psychopath.
Start with asking you some questions about your behavior when you were young. Did you ever do anything? Did you ever get in trouble at school?
To assess a subject, a trained clinician integrates information from a person's file and other collateral data. It is estimated that about 1% of the population may have the disorder. Many, like Pat Frizzell, imprisoned for violent crimes, are denied parole. They are 3 times more likely to reoffend and 4 times more likely to violently reoffend. The checklist is widely used around the world and has proven both reliable and valid as a predictor of criminal and violent behavior. Because psychopaths are high risk for breaking the law, many end up in jail. Of inmates serving sentences for violent crimes, about 20% score high on the psychopathy checklist. It is a disturbing fact, however, that the great majority of psychopaths are out in the real world undetected. They live on the narrow margins of the law, often engaging in cold-blooded and predatory behavior. These individuals cause incalculable damage to other people.
Okay, so think about that for a little bit. About 1% of the population. That's kind of a lot of people. And if you really look at the prison population, I mean, the estimates are, they're actually kind of all over the board, but you'd probably be safe at saying 25% of the people in prison meet the criteria for psychopathy. Now, I had the opportunity to meet several individuals that were diagnosed as psychopaths in state psychiatric facilities, so like state mental hospitals. They were forensic facilities, but these individuals were typically found incompetent to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity, or they just couldn't keep them in the general population or in the mental health units in the prison or jail, so they end up in psychiatric hospitals, and they stay there for a very long time. It's really startling when you see someone in a psychiatric hospital that, for, I mean, like, sake of argument, seems really, really normal. Typically, they're not taking any medications, maybe some anti-anxiety medication or something like that. But they've committed horrific acts. They're not psychotic. They don't have hallucinations or delusions. Typically, they're pretty aggressive. But they're in these facilities like that. Now, also, the comment about psychopaths among us, I want you to think about that. In this book right here is Dr. Hare's latest, it's his latest book here, called Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work, and he wrote this book with Paul Babiak. This is about psychopaths in the workplace. It has some fascinating stories. If you're interested in that, I would highly recommend that book. Okay, so the psychopathy checklist revised. And there's a number of different psychopathy checklists. If we were in the classroom, I would bring in this material so you could see it. So clinicians have these forms that they fill out, and it gives you like a standardized score. And really what you're looking for is people over 30 on the PCLR. And when you see people like that, I mean, it's obvious that something is not quite right. And these factors, there's different factors and then facets that are differentiated by Dr. Hare. And the first one is interpersonal factors or facets. And glibness is like superficial charm. Somebody that can just walk into a room and they have like an candid ability to chat it up with just about anybody that's in there. A good example of that are politicians that can go into a room and just talk and talk and talk, and they're very charming, but the charm is superficial. Next one is grandiose sense of self-worth. So, I mean, you think you are the bomb. Pathological lying, cunning and manipulativeness, like conning others for your own gain. So that's the interpersonal facet. The affective facet, oh, let me go back. Affective, okay, your affect is your emotional response to a specific stimulus. So you have your mood, which is your overall emotional tone. Affect is how you respond to specific stimulus. Like, you just got in a fight with somebody. How do you feel about that in the moment? Somebody that's a psychopath would have a lack of remorse or guilt. They're going to have shallow emotions. They're going to be callous or have a lack of empathy. And they're going to have a failure to accept responsibility for their own actions. Alright, now, the second factor includes facet 3 and facet 4. Facet 3 is lifestyle. And so some of the characteristics here are need for stimulation or proneness to boredom. God, I hate to fess up to it, but I have that a little bit. Parasitic lifestyle. That would be like a guy that meets a girl and he just moves in with her almost immediately, and she starts paying his bills and he just mooches off of other people. Lack of realistic long-term goals. Impulsiveness and irresponsibility. And then facet 4 are the antisocial factors. So poor behavioral controls. Early behavioral problems are always there. Juvenile delinquency. Revocation of conditional release means like they don't do good on parole or probation. They screw that up really quickly. And then criminal versatility means there's a lot of different crimes that they commit. And then there's other items here like many short-term marital relationships and promiscuous sexual behavior. Now, I came across this book while I was trying to put together this presentation, and it's called Pass the PCLR. And it's a guide on how to pass the psychopathy checklist, like a cheat sheet for people to use so they can pass the psychopathy checklist. Well, that video gave you some insight as to how serious the implications are of being labeled a psychopath. So if you have that diagnosis, what do you think the parole board is going to think, or probation officers, or you know, if you are in a psychiatric facility and you're diagnosed as a psychopath, man, it's going to be hard to get out. You're going to be treated very different. Now, we keep using the term psychopath, but where do you find the diagnosis of a psychopath? Where is that? Sorry, I was kind of flying around there. This is what I was looking for. Where do you find this diagnosis? Is it in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders? 4th edition? Text revision? Who, by the way, is put out by the American Psychiatric Association. A lot of students think it's the American Psychological Association. It's not. So it's really put together by psychiatrists. None that really matters. This is the diagnostic manual that all psychologists use. But guess what? Psychopathy is not in there. You're not going to find that diagnosis. Now, it ends up in charts all the time, and everybody knows what you're talking about when you say it, but it's not like a sanctioned diagnosis. Not by the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, American Medical Association. It's not. Now, we have a new DSM that's coming out in 2013. I don't think it's going to be in there either. But there's two things that are very, very similar. One is antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of the violation of the rights of other people. Now, that kind of sounds like a psychopath, but it's not quite there. And what I really want you to do is, when you stop this video, Google DSM criteria antisocial personality disorder. So study that and look at that. And then narcissistic personality disorder. What is narcissism? Do you know what that is? Did you take a class that taught you that? Well, that takes care of the extreme egocentricity component of psychopath. If you put these two together, so both these personality disorders at the same time, you basically have the diagnostic criteria of psychopathy or psychopathic personality disorder, whatever you want to call it. So do we have a diagnosis, an official diagnosis for psychopath as psychologists or psychiatrists or medical doctors? No. But if you have these two disorders together, it makes up most of the criteria. Oh.
The problem with psychopaths, psychologists say, is that they're everywhere.
Okay, this guy's name is John Ronson. Now, he's an author. He's like an investigative journalist. He wrote like The Men Who Stare at Goats, and he recently came out with a really fascinating book called The Psychopath Test. So this video is a little long, but I want you to watch it. It's really fascinating. And his book, I'm telling you, is really good. So it's somebody that's not from the psychology world writing about psychopaths, and I really enjoyed his book. I would recommend that to you.
Some say 1 in every 100 of us is a psychopath. They aren't all in jail or in mental health facilities. You probably passed one on the street today. And it's not like you can tell who they are. Their verbal and non-verbal clues are invisible to unsuspecting civilians. Many are very high-functioning people who excel in politics and business. A strange story began when I was contacted by a man called Tony. He was in Broadmoor Hospital, formerly known as Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. He said he faked madness to avoid a prison sentence, and now he's stuck. So I visited Tony. The patients were all wearing sweatpants, overweight, medicated. And then Tony turned up, and he was wearing a pinstripe suit. It was the outfit of a man who wanted to convince the world that he was very sane. He said it's really hard to persuade people you're not crazy. How do you sit in the same way? How do you cross your legs in the same way? How do you smile in a sane way? I believed him. He seemed very nice and normal. And then, later, I heard from Broadmoor. Yes, they said, they now accept that Tony faked his original symptoms of mental illness. But what he is instead, they explained, is a psychopath. The clues are there. The pinstripe suit, that's item 1 on the psychopath checklist. Glibness, superficial charm. Then there's the deceitful way he faked madness to get out of a prison sentence. That's item 5, conning, manipulative. Faking your brain going wrong can qualify as evidence that your brain has gone wrong. Then some psychologists said something extraordinary. They said Tony's type of madness was the madness that makes the world go around. There's a preponderance of psychopaths, people with a complete lack of human empathy, at the heart of the political and business elites. And so I set about learning how to become kind of a qualified psychopath spotter. I learned the 20-point psychopath checklist from its inventor, Robert Hare. Armed with my new skills, I journeyed into the corridors of power. I found myself at the home of a legendary Fortune 500 CEO among his many sculptures of predators hunting prey. He was sitting below a massive oil painting of himself over the mantelpiece. This suggested item 2 on the psychopath checklist, grandiose sense of self-worth. I visited a former Haitian death squad leader, jailed in upstate New York for the unlikely crime of mortgage fraud. Something started to happen to me during all of this. My psychopath spotting powers did something to my head. I started spotting psychopaths everywhere. Were some of my friends psychopaths? My colleagues? I got drunk with power. I became such a determined, resolute psychopath hunter, I turned a bit psychopathic myself. I began to realise just how so many people, journalists as well as psychologists and criminal profilers and reality TV producers and drug companies, are eager to see the madness in people. Mental health labelling is creeping closer to the boundary of normal. Difficult toddlers are now bipolar children. What I discovered is a fascinating tale of the corrosive dangers of reducing people to their maddest pitches.
Okay, it's interesting and it's pretty provocative. You can find lots of interviews with him about how he went about investigating this book. Really, really interesting. But his stories are good. Let's watch an interview with a legitimate psychopath. So the next video you're going to see has a man by the name of Joel Rifkin in it. You may have heard his name before, maybe not. You might be too young. But he committed his crimes between like 1989 and 1993 in New York City and potentially the surrounding area. So he was convicted of murdering 9 women that were mostly prostitutes, but they suspect that he might have killed as many as 17 women. So let's watch this video with him. And then this video is a nice segue because it introduces Dr. Adrian Rain, who you remember from other videos in this class, and starts talking about his brain. Now, Adrian Rain will say some other weird stuff, but that kind of leads us to the end of the lecture. What I want you to do is start becoming a psychopath detective, just like John Ronson, and watch him, watch Joel Rifkin, and see if you can identify some of the traits that we've been talking about.
You don't grow up, wanting to be locked away forever and, being a mass murderer. You grow up wanting to be a ball player, a race car driver, a fireman, things like that. I want to know what happened, both for myself and the girls that I hurt, killed.
Joel Rifkin confessed to the murders of 17 women. What caused this man to kill? He believes it all started in his brain.
Apparently I have a deficit in this frontal lobe area, and my thought process is not your thought process.
So he's allowed cutting-edge science to explore his brain in the hopes of finding an answer to the question that plagues him. Why does he kill? I visited with the 51-year-old inmate in an upstate New York prison.
One of the earlier homicides or nights or events might have been euphoric, and then I was chasing it after that. The thing is, you never get that original rush. That's the whole point of why you keep chasing it.
The killing began on a winter night in 1989 after Rifkin picked up a prostitute in Manhattan.
As the night progresses, I'm in for 100. I mean, over 100, about 150 all told.
And you haven't seen any sex at all?
No. Somewhere within the next couple of hours, I just got fed up and I started hitting her. Basically, beat her till my arms got tired. And then we wrestled on the floor and I ended up strangling her. I'm starting to realize that I had done something that, this is not good. This is extremely screwed up.
Not screwed up enough to stop him from a clean-up process nearly as grotesque as his unconscionable crime.
I cut her up with a hobby knife.
You started severing the body.
Yeah, made it as small as I could.
Must be pretty difficult.
Basically, I cut everything to the joint and then would pop the joints out. Did the legs the same way, and proceeded to take her head off. So now I had 6 pieces that I wrapped up and casually loaded into the trunk of the car throughout the day.
But how could someone act casually after killing and dissecting another person? Neuroscientist Dr. Daniel Amen analyzed Rifkin's brain scan.
When I looked at Joel Rifkin's scan, I thought to myself, this is a brain that is vulnerable to violence. He had low activity in his prefrontal cortex, that most human, thoughtful part of the brain.
See, for example, in these scans, the image of the normal brain is brighter in the front, and in the murderer's brain, that same region is dark.
It's an area they call the frontal lobe. In its simplest form, that's where we have our conscience.
So do Rifkin's scans show that he's missing a conscience? Could a faulty brain have played a role in the brutal murders of so many women?
There are good nights with prostitutes, there are bad nights with prostitutes. There are times you get ripped off, there are times things go as planned.
Joel Rifkin committed his final murder in June of 1993.
She was the 3rd or 4th girl I was with that night. In the back seat of the car, strangled her, drove her home.
He wrapped up Tiffany Bresciani's body and stuck her in the trunk before turning the car over to his mother to run some errands.
Mom could have put groceries in the trunk that morning. None of it made sense by that time.
With notable indifference, Rifkin told me that he later transferred the decomposing body to the back of the family pickup truck. But on the highway, a license plate happened to fall off, and he was stopped by the police.
Troopers discovered that there was the body of a female, a white female, in the back of the pickup.
I was under arrest. I don't know. I knew that was it.
Did you do it, Joel? What do you have to say? What do you have to say, Joel?
At a cognitive level, psychopaths know right from wrong, but they don't have the feeling for what's right and wrong. We have 41 murderers.
Dr. Adrian Rain has studied psychopaths for 30 years. Both he and Dr. Amen believe that while the psychopathic mind can't be cured, it may be treatable, starting with a diet high in omega-3s.
There have even been 2 studies conducted already, which have given omega-3 to young prisoners, and both have shown that after about 4 months of omega-3 treatment, there's a 35% reduction in serious offending within the prison. So we can stop the rot.
Early intervention could be the key.
The sad thing is, if I would have seen him, perhaps as a teenager, and helped to remediate his brain, that he would have been less likely, I think, to act out in violent ways.
Do you think if you'd had an intervention when you were younger, you might not have done what you did?
Wow. If this is what they could have seen when I was 8 or 10, then maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe I could have gotten the therapy or the drugs I needed.
Maybe some people would have survived.
Yeah. And maybe now the next kid who comes along can be helped.
But this discussion has sparked an explosive legal debate. If these killers have bad brains, does that excuse their actions?
A real concern that society has is that brain imaging research will be used to exonerate psychopathic murderous individuals who should be put to death or who should be locked up for life.
It's been coined neurolaw, and it carries profound implications on the question of accountability. In fact, Rain testified in the capital murder case of Donta Page, a young man from a troubled home.
We brain scanned this individual, Donta Page, and found that he had much poorer functioning in the part of the brain that's involved in controlling and regulating behavior. Put all the factors together, the abuse, the poverty, together with the poor brain functioning, and here's a walking recipe for later violence.
Page was spared the death penalty in part because of his brain scans.
Is that the right decision? if we buy into the line of thinking that I put forward to the judge and jury, then is this a slippery slope to Armageddon?
What do you say to those who say this is just making excuses for criminal murderous behaviour? That basically trying to find the answer in the brain is a sophisticated way of excusing your behaviour?
That's their opinion. It gives me part of an answer. It's not the complete answer. You know, does this mean I was destined to do what I did? I don't know.
Okay, so that should bring up a lot of questions for you. I mean, my quick response is like, if you know that a car has brakes that have failed, you don't let people go and drive it on the road. Or if a passenger jet has a problem, they don't let it take off with everybody on board. You know what I mean? If you don't, think about that a little bit. Now, the research, the like neuropsychiatric research, is fascinating and complex. And Adrian Rain has written an entire book on the earlier research in the field, and I could go through and summarize it, but your textbook will really do a pretty good job of that. What I want to do is highlight some of the more recent research from the past like year or so, and then discuss some problems with that really quickly. So the first thing is that the frontal lobes always creep in, and we have good solid evidence that the frontal lobes, or the prefrontal cortex, are really involved in this behavior, but there's some problems with that, which we'll discuss later. So researchers have reported that images of prisoners' brains show important differences between those who are diagnosed as psychopaths and those who aren't. They found reductions in connectivity between an area of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala in a pathway called the uncinate fasciculus. So what is that? Well, the amygdala is right here. Everybody that's taken like an intro to psychology class or biological basis of behavior for the past 100 years knows that the amygdala is like fear and aggression, fear, aggression, fear, and aggression. So there would be pathways. This is like in the limbic system, so a subcortical structure, and then there's pathways out to the cortex. So it's the connection between these areas that seems to show the deficit. Other research reports that psychopathy is actually a distinct neurodevelopmental subgroup of antisocial personality disorder. So the researchers reported recently that psychopaths had structural brain abnormalities in key areas of their social brains when compared to inmates that were just diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So here they used MRI scans of 44 adult male offenders diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And the crimes that were committed were pretty serious. Murder, rape, attempted murder, and grievous bodily harm. Now, of 44, only 17 met the criteria for psychopathy. So, we have a number of individuals that did not. Now, 17 is pretty small, but again, we'll talk about that problem later on. And they also scanned the brains of 22 normal, healthy non-offenders. These researchers found that psychopaths displayed significant reduced gray matter volumes in the anterior rostral prefrontal cortex and temporal poles when compared to antisocial personality disorder without psychopathy offenders and healthy non-offenders. So these are areas that are involved with understanding other people's emotions and intentions and thinking about moral behavior. When people have damage to these areas, it's typically associated with impaired empathizing and reduced fear, reduced guilt, and reduced embarrassment. So that's kind of interesting. You can see those graphics there. There's the temporal pole right there, and then the rostral prefrontal cortex. And this is the last study that we're going to go over. This is an interesting study because it links psychopathy to the central reward pathway in the brain. They report that psychopathy appears to be wired to keep seeking a reward at any cost, and implicates the brain's reward system. So psychopaths might seek reward despite potential costs. So they reported that a hyperactive dopaminergic reward system may be the foundation for some of the most problematic behaviors associated with psychopathy, such as violent crime, recidivism, and substance abuse. So what did these researchers do? This is kind of an interesting study. So the central reward pathway is a dopamine pathway, and it really, the key structure is the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. If you look here, here's the ventral tegmental area deep in the brainstem and the nucleus accumbens. And so this forms a dopamine pathway. It's called the mesolimbic system, or the dopaminergic mesolimbic system. That's the brain's central reward pathway. This area receives a ton of attention in substance abuse research. And then it has projections up to the prefrontal cortex. So these researchers looked at PET scans that measure metabolism and functional MRI that measures metabolism and structure to measure dopamine release in the reward pathways. Now this is in contrast to like Eysenk's theory. Eysenck would have thought that the opposite would have happened. So what did they do? Well, a dopaminergic drug are amphetamines. So here the researchers gave amphetamines to people with psychopathy, and then they scanned their brains using PET scans. The dopamine release in response to being given the stimulant was measured. So people with high levels of psychopathic traits had almost 4 times the amount of dopamine release in response to amphetamine. So amphetamine makes dopaminergic neurons leak amphetamine. So the psychopaths get this huge reward rush compared to those that score lower on psychopathic traits. Then the next thing that they did was kind of interesting. So this is like phase 2 of the study. The subjects were told that they would receive a monetary reward for completing like a simple task. And while they were doing this simple task, they used fMRI. And the researchers found that those individuals with elevated psychopathic traits were much more active in their reward pathway while they were anticipating the monetary reward as compared to those that were low in psychopathic traits. So you might see like this revved up reward system in psychopaths that you don't see in normal people, that just drive them impulsively towards whatever goal they have, whatever it is they want. And that really can give us some insight into psychopathic behavior. Okay, now, quick. Problems with this research. Actually, I want you to think about the problems with this research. I'll give you a couple, but I want you to think of a couple more. So number one is that the population, the N of all these studies, is really small. And if the estimates are that 1% of the population meets the criteria for psychopathy, that is a gigantic number of people. So why do we have studies with an N of 17 or 22 or 40? Why not 400? Well, you probably know the answer. It's because we rely on incarcerated individuals for a majority of these studies. So they're in jail. They've been caught. Technically, we can differentiate them from the rest of the psychopath population. We could call them unsuccessful psychopaths versus successful psychopaths who have avoided detection. So maybe our research is fatally flawed in that area. Okay, so that's just one thing. I want you to think of a handful more. We'll probably have that as a discussion question in the class. But I hope this gives you some good insight. Read the book, watch the other videos. This is great material. And unfortunately, maybe you have recognized these characteristics in some individuals in your life. But fortunately, now you'll be able to recognize those characteristics in individuals in your life in the future. And, you know, the answer is kind of stay away, because there's no such thing as like a constructive psychopath or a psychopath that does good. It's always going to go bad. There's always going to be a wake of destruction in the past. They're always going to be taking advantage of other people, lying, conning, manipulating, violating trust. The idea that they're all going to be serial killers or mass murderers, totally ridiculous. But there's always going to be that violation of the rights of other people. So, think about this. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns.